The moment I heard my wife whisper those words on the phone, I thought my marriage was over, but I was only hearing half the truth. If someone had told me that one harmless lie could unravel everything I thought I knew about the person I loved most, I would have laughed it off. Looking back now, I wish I had never opened that door. My name is Daniel Carter, and until that Friday afternoon, I believed my marriage was steady. Emily and I had been together for 8 years, married for 5, living in a quiet neighborhood outside Columbus, Ohio. We weren't the couple who posted perfect anniversary photos every month or flooded social media with romantic captions. We were ordinary. We shared grocery lists, argued over whose turn it was to unload the dishwasher, watched football together on Sundays, and planned little weekend road trips whenever we could. From the outside, everything looked normal. Maybe that's why I ignored the tiny changes for so long. Emily had become quieter over the last few months. She smiled, but not with the same warmth that used to light up the room. She started taking more phone calls outside on the back porch. Sometimes I'd walk into the kitchen, and she'd quickly lock her screen before setting her phone face down on the counter. None of those things proved anything. People get stressed. Life gets busy. I kept telling myself that. But doubt has a strange way of growing in silence. It doesn't arrive all at once. It sneaks in through little cracks until every innocent moment starts looking suspicious. I hated the person I was becoming. Every delayed text message made me wonder who she was talking to. Every late stop after work felt like another unanswered question. I never found any evidence of betrayal. Not a single message. Not a single receipt. Not a single real reason to stop trusting my wife. Yet somehow that made it worse. My imagination filled every empty space. One night after Emily had gone to bed, I found myself scrolling through story after story online about relationships falling apart because one spouse ignored the warning signs. The comments were full of people saying the same thing. If you really want to know someone, watch. What happens when life falls apart? I wish I had closed my laptop right then. Instead, one sentence settled into my mind and refused to leave. If Emily truly loved me, would she still stand beside me if I had nothing left to offer? It sounds ridiculous now, but at the time it felt like the only way to silence the doubts. I wasn't trying to trap her. At least that's what I told myself. I convinced myself I was searching for reassurance, not proof of failure. The next morning, I barely heard anything my manager said during our weekly meeting because I'd already made my decision. Around 4:30 that afternoon, I drove home more slowly than usual, rehearsing the same sentence over and over until it almost sounded believable. My palms were sweating as I pulled into the driveway. Emily's car was already there. The porch light had just switched on automatically as the evening sun disappeared behind the trees. I sat in my truck for another 2 minutes, staring at the front door, wondering whether I should turn the engine back on and forget the entire idea. Instead, I walked inside. Emily was in the kitchen chopping vegetables for dinner while soft country music played through the speaker by the window. She smiled when she saw me, the same familiar smile I'd seen thousands of times before. For one brief second, I almost told her the truth. Then I remembered every unanswered question that had kept me awake at night. I took a slow breath and said the words that would change everything. Emily. I got fired today. The knife stopped moving. She looked directly into my eyes without saying a single word. The smile disappeared. Her face became impossible to read. For what felt like an entire minute, the only sound in the house was the humming refrigerator. Then she quietly placed the knife on the cutting board, whispered, "I need a minute," and walked down the hallway before gently closing the bedroom door behind her. I stood alone in the kitchen, convinced I had just taken the first step toward discovering the truth. I had no idea that before the night was over, I would overhear a conversation that would destroy every assumption I had made. The bedroom door clicked. Shut so softly that it almost sounded gentle, but to me it felt louder than any argument we had ever had. I remained frozen in the kitchen, staring at the vegetables Emily had been cutting only seconds earlier. Nothing about the room looked different, yet everything suddenly felt unfamiliar. I expected her to come back after a minute, wrap her arms around me, or at least ask what had happened at work. Instead, the silence stretched longer and longer. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. I walked to the refrigerator, poured myself a glass of water, and barely took a sip before setting it back down. My heart kept telling me to go check on her, but another part of me insisted that interrupting would ruin the test I had created. Eventually the bedroom door opened. Emily stepped into the hallway with red eyes, although it was difficult to tell whether she had been crying or simply rubbing them. She looked at me for a brief moment before forcing a small smile. "Have you eaten anything today?" she asked quietly. The question caught me off guard. I had prepared myself for disappointment, anger, blame, or panic. I had not expected her first concern to be whether I had skipped lunch. I shook my head. She nodded once and returned to the kitchen without another word. She finished preparing dinner almost mechanically, moving from one task to another with unusual precision. Normally she chatted while cooking, telling me stories about her coworkers or asking about my day. That evening there was almost nothing. The country music continued playing in the background, filling the spaces where conversation should have been. During dinner she barely touched her own plate. She asked practical questions instead. Did they explain why? Will your health insurance continue through the end of the month? Did they offer any severance? Every question was calm, organized, almost businesslike. Instead of making me feel supported, it made me feel strangely uneasy. I answered with details I had invented during the drive home, trying to keep the story believable. The lies came easier than I expected, and that realization bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Emily listened carefully without interrupting. When I finished, she simply nodded again and looked down at her plate. There was no speech about getting through this together. No promise that everything would be all right. No emotional reassurance. The silence became its own answer, and my imagination eagerly filled in the blanks. Maybe she was already calculating what her future would look like without me. Maybe she regretted every financial decision we had made together. Maybe losing my job had instantly changed the way she saw me. I hated those thoughts, but once they appeared, I could not push them away. After dinner she insisted on washing every dish herself even though it was usually my responsibility. I offered to help twice, and both times she politely declined. "I just need something to keep my hands busy," she said with a tired smile. I watched her through the doorway, searching for some clue that would explain what was happening inside her mind. There was nothing obvious. Just quiet determination. Around 8 o'clock, her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. She glanced at the screen and picked it up immediately. I noticed the name disappear before I could read it. "I need to make a quick call," she said. "I will be right back." She slipped on a light sweater even though the evening was warm and stepped onto the back porch, closing the sliding glass door behind her. Through the window I could see her pacing slowly across the wooden deck. She held the phone tightly with both hands, occasionally stopping to look out toward the dark backyard. At first I tried to respect her privacy. I sat on the couch and turned on the television, but I could not focus on anything happening on the screen. My eyes kept drifting toward the porch. Every few moments she lowered her voice until I could not hear a thing, then spoke again with greater urgency. The conversation lasted much longer than any ordinary check-in with a friend. 10 minutes became 15. 15 became 20. A familiar knot tightened in my stomach. I told myself there had to be a reasonable explanation, yet the timing felt impossible to ignore. Less than 4 hours after I told her I had lost my job, she was outside having a secret conversation that she clearly did not want me to hear. Curiosity slowly overpowered common sense. Without making a sound, I stood from the couch and walked toward the hallway that led closer to the back door. I still believed I was looking for reassurance. I still believed that whatever I heard would finally put my fears to rest. Instead, I was about to hear the first sentence that would make every terrible possibility seem real. The hallway was dark except for the faint glow from the kitchen light spilling across the hardwood floor. I stopped a few feet from the sliding glass door, careful not to let the floorboards creak beneath my weight. Emily stood with her back to me on the porch, her shoulders tense as she looked out into the yard. The glass muted her voice just enough that I could only catch pieces of what she was saying. I hated myself for listening, but I could not bring myself to walk away. My own lie had placed me here, waiting for answers that I suddenly was not sure I wanted to hear. Then her voice became a little louder. He finally told me. My chest tightened instantly. There was a short pause while the person on the other end responded. I could not hear their voice, only Emily's. She closed her eyes for a moment and nodded as if they could somehow see her through the phone. Yes, she said softly. It happened today. Another pause. My pulse began pounding so loudly that I almost missed her next sentence. I knew it was coming eventually. Those words echoed in my mind like a warning siren. Knew it was coming. How could she have known? Had someone warned her before I supposedly lost my job? Had she been preparing for this without telling me? Or was she talking about something completely different? My thoughts raced faster than logic could keep up. Emily took a slow breath. No, he does not know anything yet. I felt every muscle in my body go rigid. Does not know anything. The sentence landed like a weight on my chest. There was something else. Something she believed I was completely unaware of. The doubt I had been carrying for months suddenly felt less like insecurity and more like confirmation. I leaned a fraction closer, trying not to make a sound. Please do not say anything to him, Emily continued. Not until everything is ready. My stomach dropped. Everything is ready. Ready for what? My imagination immediately began creating answers, each one worse than the last. Was she planning to leave? Was there money she had hidden? Had she already made arrangements for a different future? I hated that those possibilities came so naturally to me, but once they appeared, they refused to disappear. Emily rested one hand against the porch railing and lowered her voice again. I could only make out scattered words. Timing, difficult. I never wanted this. I pressed my ear a little closer to the glass, frustrated that I could not hear every sentence. Then she spoke clearly once more. He cannot find out before I tell him myself. My heartbeat seemed to stop. I stared at her silhouette against the dim porch light, trying to reconcile the woman outside with the wife I thought I knew. Every conversation we had shared over the past several months replayed inside my head. Every late evening at work. Every unexpected phone call. Every moment she had stepped outside to talk privately. I had dismissed each one because I trusted her. Now they lined up in my memory like pieces of a puzzle I had been too blind to solve. The person on the other end spoke for several seconds. Emily shook her head firmly. No, she replied. He is already overwhelmed. This is not the right time. Overwhelmed. The word stung because, at least from her perspective, she believed I had actually lost my job. Yet instead of comforting me, she was discussing another secret she intended to keep. I wanted to throw open the door and demand an explanation. I wanted to tell her the truth about my fake firing and ask what she was hiding. But if I interrupted now, I would never know the rest of the conversation. I stayed exactly where I was, barely breathing. Emily glanced toward the house for a brief second, and I quickly stepped farther into the shadows of the hallway. When she looked away again, she sighed deeply. I just hope he understands when the time comes, she whispered. There was another long silence before she added one sentence. That sent my mind into complete chaos. If everything goes according to plan, his whole life is about to change. I closed my eyes, convinced I had finally uncovered the truth I had feared for months. What I did not realize was that I had only heard half of a conversation, and the half I had missed would completely change the meaning of every word I thought I understood. Emily remained silent for several seconds, listening carefully to the person on the other end of the call. I could see her nodding slowly, wiping at the corner of one eye before taking another deep breath. My mind was already writing a story that felt painfully convincing. Every sentence I had overheard seemed to fit together into a picture I never wanted to believe. I imagined lawyers, hidden bank accounts, secret plans, and conversations that had been happening behind my back for months. It was astonishing how quickly fear could transform uncertainty into absolute certainty. Then Emily spoke again. "I know this is going to be hard for him." My heart sank even lower. Hard for me. Those words felt personal. Whatever she was planning, she believed it would hurt me. I pressed my hand against the wall beside the hallway, trying to steady myself. The logical part of my brain kept whispering that I was missing half of the conversation, but the emotional part refused to listen. It had already reached its verdict. Emily looked toward the dark yard again before quietly saying, "He has always tried to protect me." I frowned. That was not the direction I expected the conversation to take. There was affection in her voice, not resentment. She smiled sadly as she listened to the response from the other person. "That is exactly why he cannot know yet," she answered. The confusion only deepened. If she appreciated everything I had done for her, why hide something so important? I strained to hear every word, but once again her voice became almost a whisper. The wind rustled through the trees, masking several sentences completely. Frustration built inside me. I was close enough to hear pieces of the truth but too far away to understand it. Emily finally spoke louder again. "I have already started looking." "Looking for what?" My stomach twisted. "Looking for an apartment. Looking for a new job in another city. Looking for a way out." Every possibility seemed equally devastating. "There are not many options," she continued. "But I will make it work somehow." The certainty in her voice frightened me more than anything else. She sounded determined, as though she had already committed herself to a difficult decision. I realized I had unconsciously been holding my breath and forced myself to exhale. The person on the phone spoke again for nearly half a minute. Emily listened without interrupting. Finally she shook her head. "No, I cannot ask him for that. Not after what happened today." That sentence cut deeper than all the others. Whatever assistance she needed, she believed I could no longer provide it because I had supposedly lost my job. I interpreted her compassion as distance, her silence as emotional withdrawal. Looking back, I understand how dangerous assumptions can be, but in that moment they felt more convincing than facts. Emily slowly paced across the porch, wrapping one arm around herself as the evening breeze picked up. "I will figure something out tomorrow," she said. "If I have to sell it, then I will." "Sell what?" "The house." "Her car." "Something valuable." My pulse quickened again. There was another pause before she laughed softly, though there was sadness behind it. "He would be upset if he knew, but that is exactly why I cannot tell him right now." I closed my eyes. Every sentence seemed to answer one question while creating three new ones. I no longer knew which possibilities terrified me most. Had I uncovered a betrayal, or was I simply witnessing someone trying to carry a burden alone? The uncertainty was becoming unbearable. Emily thanked the person for listening and promised to call again the following day. Then, just before ending the conversation, she quietly said, "Please keep this between us until everything is finished." The call ended. She lowered the phone and remained standing perfectly still, staring into the darkness for nearly a full minute. From where I stood, I could see her shoulders trembling slightly as she took several slow breaths. She was clearly emotional, yet I still could not understand why. I hurried back toward the living room before she came inside, pretending to scroll aimlessly through television channels. A few moments later the sliding door opened. Emily smiled at me, but it was the kind of smile people wear when they are trying to protect someone else from their own worries. "Everything all right?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Yes," she answered almost immediately. "It was just my sister Sarah checking on me." I forced a smile in return, but inside, nothing felt all right anymore. If that conversation had truly been with Sarah, then I had only heard scattered pieces of something much larger, and for the first time since this terrible idea began, I started wondering whether the biggest mistake I had made was not lying about losing my job, but believing that half the truth was enough to understand the whole story. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, fragments of Emily's conversation replayed in my head. "He does not know anything yet. I have already started looking. If I have to sell it, then I will." By sunrise I had convinced myself that I had uncovered a hidden plan, even though I still did not know what the plan actually was. Emily woke before I did, or at least she pretended to. When I walked into the kitchen, she already had coffee waiting for me. She smiled gently and asked if I had any ideas about updating my resume. The concern in her voice sounded genuine, but my mind kept searching for hidden meaning behind every word. I hated that I could no longer accept simple kindness without questioning it. Throughout breakfast she kept encouraging me. She suggested reaching out to former coworkers, updating my professional profile online, and even taking a few days before making any major decisions. It was exactly what a supportive spouse would say. Yet because of what I believed I had heard the previous evening, every encouraging sentence somehow made me even more suspicious. Around mid-morning, Emily glanced at the clock and picked up her purse. "I need to run a few errands," she said. "I should be back before lunch." I nodded and watched her leave. Through the front door. Less than 30 seconds later, I realized I had made another terrible decision. I grabbed my keys and quietly followed her. She drove across town instead of toward the grocery store we usually used. I stayed several cars behind, feeling increasingly ashamed of what I was doing, but unable to stop. Eventually she pulled into the parking lot of a small shopping plaza. I parked on the opposite side and watched from a distance. Emily stepped out of her car, looked at her phone, and walked into a jewelry store. My heart immediately sank. A jewelry store. My imagination once again rushed ahead of reality. Was she buying something? Selling something? Meeting someone? 10 long minutes passed before another familiar car pulled into the lot. Sarah Bennett climbed out and hurried inside the same store. So Emily had been telling the truth about speaking with her sister. That should have relieved me, but instead it only created more questions. Nearly half an hour later, the two women came back outside carrying no shopping bags. They stood beside Sarah's car talking quietly. I could not hear a single word from where I sat, but I noticed Sarah reach out and hug Emily tightly. Emily nodded several times before opening her purse. She removed a small velvet box and placed it into Sarah's hands. Sarah looked surprised and immediately shook her head as if refusing it. Emily gently pushed the box back toward her and insisted. After another brief exchange, Sarah reluctantly accepted it. My stomach tightened again. That velvet box looked painfully familiar. I had given Emily a delicate diamond necklace on our third wedding anniversary. She rarely wore it because she always said it was too special for ordinary days. Was that the same box? Sarah opened it for only a second before quickly closing it again. Even from across the parking lot, I could see the sadness on both of their faces. Then I noticed something else. Emily pulled an envelope from her purse and handed it to Sarah. Sarah counted through several papers inside before slipping the envelope into her handbag. Money? Documents? I had no way of knowing. The entire exchange lasted less than 5 minutes. They hugged once more before Sarah drove away. Emily remained standing alone beside her car, staring at the empty parking space where her sister had been. She wiped her eyes, took a slow breath, and finally drove away. I did not follow immediately. I simply sat there gripping the steering wheel, overwhelmed by conflicting emotions. Nothing I had witnessed clearly supported the story I had invented the night before, yet it did not erase my doubts either. If anything, it made the mystery even deeper. On the drive home I kept replaying the scene. The hug. The velvet box. The envelope. None of it looked like someone preparing to leave a marriage. It looked more like someone making a sacrifice. But for what? When I arrived home a few minutes before Emily, I hurried inside and acted as though I had never left the house. She walked through the front door carrying only a small grocery bag with bread and milk, smiling as if she had simply completed an ordinary errand. She apologized for taking longer than expected and asked what I wanted for dinner. I looked into her eyes, searching for any sign that she was hiding something from me. Instead of finding guilt, I saw exhaustion, worry, and something else I could not quite identify. Whatever secret Emily was carrying, it no longer felt like it was about escaping from me. It felt like she was carrying a burden entirely on her own, and for the first time since this began, I wondered whether I had been asking the wrong question all along. Over the next 2 days, Emily seemed busier than I had ever seen her. She still checked in on me constantly, asking whether I had heard back from any companies and reminding me that one setback did not define my future. She even printed out a list of local networking events and left it on the kitchen table with a handwritten note that simply said, "You have always figured things out before. I believe you will again." Every gesture should have made me feel grateful, but instead it left me feeling guilty. I was lying to her every minute we spent together, and yet I still could not let go of the questions that had driven me to create this situation in the first place. On the third afternoon, Emily received another call from Sarah. This time she did not step outside. She walked into the guest bedroom and gently closed the door, leaving it open just enough that faint voices drifted into the hallway. I had no intention of listening again. At least that was what I told myself as I walked toward the kitchen. But then I heard Emily quietly say, "Did they accept the offer?" My feet stopped moving. Sarah's voice was too soft to understand, but Emily answered almost immediately. "That is wonderful. Even if it is less than we hoped, it is enough." Enough for what? I remained where I was, ashamed of myself but unable to leave. Emily let out a long breath that sounded almost like relief. "Please transfer everything into the new account," she said. "I do not want him to notice anything unusual." My stomach tightened again. A new account. Hidden money. Every suspicion threatened to return at once. Then Sarah apparently asked a question because Emily responded with unexpected emotion. "Because if he really lost his job, I refuse to let him think he failed us." I froze. The word struck me harder than anything I had heard before. Emily continued, her voice trembling. "He has carried this family for years. If this is our turn to carry him, then that is exactly what we are going to do." I stared at the floor, unable to process what I was hearing. Sarah spoke again, and this time Emily laughed softly through tears. "Yes, I sold the necklace. I know he loved giving it to me, but it was just jewelry. Daniel matters more than jewelry." My throat suddenly felt dry. The velvet box. It had been the anniversary necklace after all. She had not sold it because she wanted to erase memories of our marriage. She had sold it because she believed I needed help. Emily continued before I could recover. "I have also been applying for evening bookkeeping work. It is only part-time, but if I can bring in another $800 a month, we can cover the mortgage until he gets back on his feet." My knees felt weak. Every assumption I had made was collapsing one piece at a time. The secret account was not a plan to leave me. It was an emergency fund she was building for us. The jewelry store had not been the beginning of an ending. It had been an act of sacrifice. Sarah must have asked whether I would be upset because Emily answered gently, "Of course he would. He would tell me to keep the necklace and never make these sacrifices. That is exactly why I cannot tell him until everything is settled. I know my husband. He would rather struggle than let me give up something that means so much to me. Tears filled my eyes before I even realized they were there. For days I had convinced myself that Emily's silence meant she had stopped loving me. In reality, she had been carrying the weight of protecting both of us while believing I had just experienced one of the worst days of my career. She had never withdrawn from me. She had simply shifted all of her energy towards solving a problem that did not even exist. Sarah said something that made Emily grow quiet for several seconds. Finally Emily whispered, "I only wish he knew that his job has never been the reason I married him. I would choose him in a tiny apartment with folding chairs before I would choose anyone else in a mansion." I closed my eyes as those words settled into my heart. Every fear that had pushed me toward this cruel experiment suddenly looked embarrassingly small beside the quiet strength of the woman I had married. The person who had failed the test was not Emily. It was me. And standing there outside the guest bedroom, listening to the truth I had been too afraid to trust, I realized I had created a lie that had forced the kindest person I knew to sacrifice something precious for absolutely no reason. For the rest of that afternoon I could barely look Emily in the eyes. Every smile she gave me felt like another reminder of the trust one had broken before she had ever done anything to deserve my suspicion. She spent the evening searching online for job openings that she thought might fit my experience, reading descriptions aloud from the couch while I answered with distracted nods. She believed she was helping her husband rebuild his confidence after losing his career. The truth was that I was sitting only a few feet away, trying to find the courage to admit that I had lied. About everything. By the time dinner was over, I knew I could not allow another hour to pass. Every additional minute would only deepen the damage I had already caused. Emily carried 2 mugs of tea into the living room and sat beside me. The television was on, but neither of us was watching it. I took a long breath and turned toward her. "Emily," I said quietly, "there is something I need to tell you." She immediately looked concerned. "Did something else happen?" she asked. I shook my head. "Yes," I answered honestly. "But it is not what you think." My voice was already beginning to shake. I had rehearsed this conversation dozens of times in my head, yet now that the moment had arrived, every prepared sentence disappeared. "I need you to let me finish before you say anything," I whispered. She nodded slowly, setting her mug on the coffee table. I was not fired. The room became completely silent. Emily blinked once, as though she had not heard me correctly. "What?" she asked. I swallowed hard. "I still have my job. I never lost it." She continued staring at me without speaking. There was no anger on her face yet. Only confusion. "Then why?" she began before stopping herself. I lowered my eyes. "Because I wanted to see how you would react." Even saying the words aloud made me feel ashamed. Emily leaned back against the couch, saying nothing. The silence that followed was far more painful than if she had shouted. I forced myself to continue. I convinced myself that something had changed between us. I started imagining things. I thought maybe you were pulling away because... My voice cracked. "Because you only wanted the version of me who was successful." Emily looked at me as though I were a stranger. I could not blame her. "I overheard your phone call on the porch," I admitted. "Then I followed you to the shopping plaza. I listened again when Sarah called today." Her expression changed instantly. It was not outrage. It was heartbreak. A quiet, heavy disappointment settled over her face in a way I had never seen before. She closed her eyes for several seconds before asking one simple question. "You followed me?" I nodded, unable to defend myself. "And you listened to private conversations with my sister?" Another nod. She took a slow breath and folded her hands together in her lap. Tears gathered in her eyes, but her voice remained calm. "Daniel," she said softly, "did you really believe that little of me?" The question pierced straight through every excuse I had been holding on to. I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out. She was not asking whether I had been insecure. She was asking whether I believed the woman who had stood beside me for 8 years would abandon me the moment life became difficult. I finally managed to speak. "No," I whispered. "At least. I did not think I believed that until I let fear convince me otherwise." Emily looked down at the floor for a long moment. "You know what hurt the most these past few days?" she asked. I slowly shook my head. "Watching you think you had failed," she replied. "I was trying to find every possible way to make sure you never felt alone. I sold something I loved because I thought it could buy you peace of mind. I was applying for extra work because I wanted you to have time to recover without worrying about the bills." She looked back into my eyes, tears finally rolling down her cheeks. "And while I was trying to protect you, you were secretly testing whether I loved you." I felt my own tears fall as the full weight of my actions settled over me. There was no defense left. No explanation that could undo what I had done. Emily reached for the tissue box on the coffee table before asking one final question, quietly and without anger. "If you could not trust my heart after all these years together, then what exactly were we building our marriage on?" I could not answer Emily's question because every possible response sounded hollow. She was right. Somewhere along the way I had allowed fear to become louder than trust, and once that happened I started looking for evidence to support my doubts instead of appreciating the years of love that had already been proven. We sat in silence for what felt like forever. The tea on the coffee table grew cold while neither of us reached for it. Finally I spoke. "I do not expect you to forgive me tonight," I said. Quietly. "I do not even know if I deserve forgiveness. I only know that I have never been more ashamed of myself." Emily looked at me for a long moment before wiping away another tear. "This was never about losing a job," she said. "People lose jobs. We would have figured that out together. What hurts is realizing that while I believed we were facing a hardship side by side, you were watching me like I was a stranger who needed to prove something." Every word was gentle, but every word was true. I nodded slowly. "I understand." She shook her head. "No, Daniel. I do not think you do. Trust is not built during the easy years. It is built by believing the person beside you even when fear gives you reasons not to." I lowered my eyes because there was nothing to argue with. She continued speaking, her voice calm despite the emotion behind it. "When you told me you lost your job, I was scared. Not because I was worried about our lifestyle. I was scared because I knew how much pride you take in providing for us. I was already thinking about how to protect you from feeling like you had failed." She smiled sadly. "I never imagined that while I was trying to protect your heart, you were measuring mine." The word stayed with me. Measuring mine. That was exactly what I had done. I had reduced years of shared memories, late-night conversations, road trips, birthdays, family holidays, and ordinary mornings over coffee into a single artificial experiment. I reached into my pocket and placed my wallet on the table. "Tomorrow," I said, "we are going back to that jewelry store. If they have not sold your necklace, I am buying it back." Emily looked at me and gently shook her head. "The necklace is not what matters." "I know," I replied. "But it matters to me because every time you look at that empty jewelry box, I do not want you to remember my insecurity." She was quiet for several seconds before speaking again. "Do you know why I kept the truth from you?" I nodded slightly. "Because you knew I would never let you make those sacrifices." She smiled faintly. "Exactly. Marriage is not keeping score. Sometimes one person carries more because the other person cannot. Then later the roles change." She reached over and took my hand for the first time since I had confessed. The gesture was small, but it meant more than I deserved. "Promise me something," she said. "The next time fear starts telling you stories about us, promise me you will bring those stories to me instead of believing them alone." I squeezed her hand gently. "I promise." She nodded. Because I cannot fight fears that you never share with me. That sentence revealed another mistake I had made. I had not only doubted Emily. I had isolated myself inside my own assumptions instead of inviting her into the conversation. We talked for hours after that. Not about jobs or money, but about everything we had quietly kept to ourselves over the past year. I admitted that stress at work had made me feel insecure long before I invented the lie. Emily admitted that she had noticed my distance but assumed I simply needed space. We realized that neither of us had intended to hurt the other. We had simply stopped saying the difficult things out loud. Before we went to bed, Emily stood in the hallway and looked back at me. "I am still hurt," she said honestly. "That will not disappear overnight." I nodded because I expected nothing less. Then she added something I will never forget. "But I married a man who is willing to admit when he is wrong. Now I need that same man to spend more time rebuilding trust than he spent creating doubt." Those words became my new responsibility, and for the first time since I had spoken that foolish lie in the kitchen, I finally understood that repairing trust would require far more courage than testing it ever had. The next morning felt different in a way I could not immediately explain. The house was quiet, but it was no longer the kind of silence filled with suspicion. It felt like the calm after a storm that had already passed through both of us and left behind the damage we now had to face together. Emily was in the kitchen when I woke up, making coffee like she always did, but this time she looked up and gave me a small, tired smile that felt real rather than guarded. I stood in the doorway for a moment, unsure of what to say, then simply walked over and sat at the table. We did not pretend that the previous days had not happened. We did not try to erase them with forced normalcy. Instead, we started the morning with honesty, even if it was uncomfortable. Emily placed a mug in front of me and sat across from me without speaking right away. Then she said, "We are going to be okay, but we are going to rebuild slowly." I nodded because I understood that trust, once shaken, does not return in a single conversation. Later that afternoon, we drove together back to the shopping plaza. Neither of us spoke much during the drive. The radio played softly, but even that felt secondary to the weight of what we were doing. When we arrived, I expected Emily to hesitate, but she walked into the jewelry store with steady steps. The same clerk greeted us, recognizing Emily immediately. She brought out the velvet box without being asked, and I could feel my chest tighten as it was placed on the counter. The necklace was still there, exactly as I remembered it, delicate and unchanged, as if it had been waiting for this moment. I reached into my wallet and paid without hesitation. Emily watched quietly as I placed the box back into her hands. She did not cry this time. Instead, she simply held it for a moment before closing her fingers around it. "It is not about the necklace," she said softly. I nodded. "I know. But I still want you to have it back." On the drive home, she finally broke the silence. "Do you remember what I told you last night?" I glanced at her. "That trust is built when fear shows up and we choose each other anyway." She nodded. "Yes. That is what we are going to practice now. Not once. Not just today. Every time fear shows up." I understood that she was not speaking about the past anymore. She was setting a direction for the future. Over the following weeks, things did not instantly return to normal. There were moments when I still felt the urge to second-guess small things, but this time I stopped myself from letting those thoughts grow in silence. Instead, I told Emily when something was bothering me, even when it felt small or irrational. And she did the same. One evening, she admitted she had been worried about my quietness at dinner. Another night, I told her I still felt guilty about everything I had done. Each conversation felt like another layer of repair being placed carefully over something fragile. Slowly, the distance that fear had created between us began to shrink. We started taking evening walks again around the neighborhood, talking about simple things like neighbors, weather forecasts, and future vacation ideas. The heaviness that had once filled our home began to fade, replaced by something quieter but stronger. One night, about a month later, we sat together on the back porch. The air was cool, and the sky above was clear. Emily leaned her head lightly on my shoulder and said, "I am still glad you told me the truth, even if it came late." I looked at her and replied, "I wish I had trusted you instead of testing you." She smiled faintly. We both learned something we needed to learn the hard way. I thought about everything that had happened, from the moment I spoke a single lie in the kitchen to the conversations that followed, and I realized something I would carry with me permanently. Trust is not something you measure when life feels uncertain. It is something you protect when uncertainty arrives. And in our case, it was not life that had tested our marriage. It was me. But it was also us choosing, after everything, to rebuild instead of walk away. That night, as we sat in silence under the stars, I finally understood that the strongest relationships are not the ones without doubt, but the ones where two people decide that honesty is always worth more than fear.